She folded her napkin with the same careful precision she had used for 7 years, set it beside her untouched dessert spoon, and smiled. Not at him. Not exactly. She smiled at the particular quality of silence that followed what he had just said, and at the fact that she had always known, in some quiet and unannounced part of herself, that this moment would come. His name was Roland Ashby. He was 38 years old, heir to Thornfield Estate in the county of Wiltshire, and he had just introduced his wife to the Viscount Pemberton's eldest son by the name of a woman who had been dead for 4 years. The woman's name had been Florence. His wife's name was Sylvia. They had married in the spring of 1887, when Sylvia was 22 and Roland was 31. It had not been a love match. Both of them knew this. Her father, a respected but quietly indebted solicitor in Bath, had arranged it over the course of 2 dinners and a long correspondence with Roland's estate manager. Roland had needed a wife who could manage a household of 14 rooms and a social calendar that required someone with both composure and organizational instinct. Sylvia's father had needed his second mortgage quietly resolved. The transaction had been dressed in the appropriate language of courtship. A few supervised afternoon walks, a bouquet of white roses, a formal proposal in the sitting room with her mother present. But neither party had been confused about its fundamental nature. Sylvia had not resented this. Not at first. She had understood the architecture of her world well enough to recognize that this was simply how certain things were built. What she had not anticipated was how completely she would disappear into the management of his life. She learned quickly. She learned which suppliers Roland preferred for the winter coal, which of the tenants required a firmer hand in correspondence, and which responded better to patience, how to arrange a dinner table, so that the 2 men who disliked each other most found themselves seated just far enough apart to remain civil. She learned that Roland took his tea too hot, that he preferred written reports to verbal summaries, that he would sit with an account ledger for an hour and still not notice a discrepancy that she could identify in 4 minutes. She learned to identify the discrepancy and then, quietly, leave the corrected figure where he would find it and believe he had found it himself. She ran Thornfield the way a river runs through limestone, steadily, invisibly, carving the shape of everything without anyone thinking much about the water. Roland was not an unkind man. She had understood this about him from almost the beginning, and she had never revised the assessment. He did not shout. He did not demean her in front of staff or guests. When she was ill with a winter fever during their 2nd year of marriage, he had sent Dr. Calloway up twice in one afternoon and had himself appeared in the doorway of her room with an expression of what she had taken, at the time, to be genuine concern. But Roland was a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by things that functioned well without requiring his attention. The estate had functioned before Sylvia. His schedule had been managed before Sylvia. His social obligations had been navigated before Sylvia by a long succession of capable women. His mother, then his older sister, then his housekeeper, Mrs. Parrish, then, briefly and unhappily, by Florence. Florence had been his first wife. She had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1883, 18 months into their marriage. Roland had not spoken of her much in the years Sylvia had known him. There was a portrait in the East Corridor, a young woman with dark eyes and a slightly guarded expression, and occasionally guests who had known the family in earlier years would say something thoughtful about her, and Roland would nod, and the subject would move on. Sylvia had asked, once, in their first year, whether he missed her. He had looked at Sylvia with what seemed like genuine surprise at the question. She was a good wife, he had said, and returned to his newspaper. Sylvia had not asked again. What she had told herself, in those early years, was that this was simply his manner. That Roland was a contained man, not an unfeeling one. That he showed care through action, through the coal supplier and the corrected ledger, and Calloway sent upstairs twice, rather than through the kind of open acknowledgement that she had read about in novels and occasionally observed in other people's marriages. She told herself this with enough conviction that for a long time she almost believed it. Almost. The first real fissure had appeared in their 4th year. It had been a small thing, as these things always are. A neighbor, Colonel Weston, had come to dinner with his wife and had said over the pheasant that Thornfield seemed to be running remarkably smoothly these days, that the autumn tenants' supper had been particularly well organized, that he didn't know how Roland managed it all. Roland had smiled and said that he had a good estate manager and an excellent housekeeper. He had not mentioned Sylvia. She had been sitting directly across from him. She had personally written every invitation to that supper, had negotiated with Cook over the menu for 2 days, had resolved a seating dispute between two tenant families that would have soured the entire evening. She had been the author of everything Colonel Weston was praising, and Roland had credited Mrs. Parrish. Sylvia had finished her wine. She had smiled at Colonel Weston's wife. She had said nothing. Afterward, when the guests had gone and Roland was reviewing some correspondence in his study, she had stood in the doorway for a moment and considered speaking. She had thought about how she might say it. Not in accusation, just in clarification, just a simple noting of the record. She had stood there long enough that he looked up. Was there something? He said. And something in the way he said it, not unkindly, but with the faint impatience of a man interrupted from something that mattered, made the sentence dissolve. No, she said. I was only checking that the fire was laid. She went to bed. She lay in the dark, and she thought about what she had not said. And she thought about Colonel Weston's face when Roland had spoken. And she thought about Mrs. Parrish, who was a perfectly good housekeeper, and who deserved her credit, and who had nothing to do with any of this. She had told herself it was not worth the disruption. She told herself that Roland was simply forgetful, that he hadn't meant anything by it, that a marriage was not an accounting of credits and debits. She told herself this 4 more times over the following 3 years, at 4 more dinners, through 4 more quiet moments of invisibility, and she almost managed to believe it each time. Almost. The autumn she turned 29, something shifted. She couldn't have named the moment precisely. It wasn't one thing. It was more like the way a door that has been swollen shut finally gives way, not because of any single push, but because of the accumulated pressure of every push that came before it. She had begun, that September, to think more carefully about money. Not with urgency, not yet, but with a kind of new attentiveness. Her maternal aunt in Edinburgh had written to say that a small property she owned, a cottage at the edge of the estate, had been rented out and was now producing a modest income, and she had asked Sylvia whether she might like to be added to the account. As she had no children and the property would pass to Sylvia eventually anyway, Sylvia had written back yes and had not mentioned it to Roland. She was not sure why. It was her aunt's property, her aunt's offer, entirely unrelated to Thornfield. But there was something about the transaction, something about the existence of a small room in the financial world that belonged only to her, that she wanted to keep for a moment before it became a subject for discussion and arrangement, and Roland's opinion about whether it was properly managed. She kept it for longer than a moment. She kept it, in fact, for the rest of that year. She also began very quietly to expand the scope of what she read. The library at Thornfield was extensive but largely agricultural and historical, suited to the interests of Roland's grandfather who had assembled it. Sylvia had always supplemented it with subscriptions to 2 periodicals and a habit of acquiring novels at the bookshop in the village when she drove in for household business. Now she began to add other things. A text on property law, dry and dense but readable if taken slowly. A book on household accounts and independent income management. A monograph by a woman who had established a small school in the north of England and had written about the considerable administrative complexity involved. She read these in the evenings, in the chair by the window in her room. Roland rarely came to her room in the evenings. This, too, was something that had settled into its shape gradually, without announcement or discussion. They had occupied separate bedrooms since their 2nd year, when Sylvia's fever had made the arrangement medically sensible, and neither of them had felt the need to revise it afterward. The marriage had not, in any meaningful physical sense, been a marriage for some time. This was a thing Sylvia had known, and not permitted herself to examine too closely. She examined it now. She was 29 years old. She had been running a large estate for 7 years with skill and consistency. She had a small independent income. She had read carefully the relevant sections of the property law text. She understood, not as an abstraction, but as a practical fact, that she had options she had not permitted herself to consider before. She did not act immediately. She was not impulsive by nature, and she was realistic enough to know that emotion was not a plan. Instead, she watched. She paid attention to things she had previously chosen not to look at too directly. She noticed that when Roland's brother Frederick visited, Roland would recount Sylvia's management of a particular difficult tenant dispute, accurately, with the right details, to Frederick, framing it as an amusing story about estate life. He did not say Sylvia had managed it. He said it had been managed. She noticed that in 7 years of marriage, Roland had never once asked her what she thought of Thornfield, whether she liked it, whether she was happy there. Not because he assumed she was happy. She did not think he assumed anything about her internal life at all. He simply did not seem to register that she had one that required asking about. She noticed that when she made suggestions about the estate, about a failing drainage system in the East Field, about a change to the tenant lease terms that would reduce late payments, Roland would listen, nod, and several weeks later would present the same idea to his estate manager as if it had occurred to him independently. She had always noticed this last thing. She had filed it under his manner, his containment, his discomfort with crediting people directly. She stopped filing it there. She also watched Florence's portrait. She had walked past it 1,000 times without looking. That autumn, she began to look. The woman in the portrait was about Sylvia's age when she'd sat for it. Early 20s, slightly formal in posture, with something in the eyes that Sylvia found difficult to read. Guarded, she had always thought. Now she thought perhaps it wasn't guardedness, perhaps it was something else. The particular expression of a woman who was managing not to show something. Sylvia did not know what Florence had been like. She had only fragments. Roland's brief characterization, which told her almost nothing, the occasional reference from older guests, the portrait. But she thought, standing in front of it one November morning, while the light came gray through the corridor windows, that she might understand something about Florence that she could not have understood 7 years ago. That was when she began to make a plan. She did not think of it as leaving, not initially. She thought of it as preparation. There was a difference, and the difference mattered to her. Leaving was reaction. Preparation was something a person did when they had finally become clear-eyed about the shape of their circumstances. She wrote to her aunt in Edinburgh and asked, with the appropriate practical framing, whether the cottage might be put into Sylvia's name directly, and whether there was room enough in the income for her to stay there for a period, if she needed to. Her aunt wrote back with the warmth of someone who had perhaps been waiting for this question for several years. The answer was yes. She continued to manage Thornfield with the same precision she had always brought to it. She did not do it carelessly, and she did not do it resentfully. She did it because it was her work and she had always done her work properly, and also because she was not the kind of woman who sabotaged before she left. She had too much regard for the tenants, for Mrs. Parrish, for the smooth running of things that others depended on, to make her exit a disaster. She began methodically to write down everything she did, every supplier contact, every tenant arrangement, every recurring obligation, every seasonal task. She organized these notes into a document that could, if given to a competent person, serve as a complete guide to the management of Thornfield in her absence. She worked on it in the evenings, in her room by the window. It took 3 months. She was not angry while she did this. She examined that fact and found she was being truthful. The anger, and there had been anger, in those early years, anger she had swallowed and categorized as unreasonableness, had burned down to something quieter and colder and much more useful. What remained was not resignation exactly. It was more like clarity. The particular clarity of a woman who has stopped waiting to be seen and has begun, instead, to see. The evening it ended happened in January. Roland had invited a small dinner party, 6 guests, which Sylvia had arranged with her usual care. The right wines, the right placement, a menu suited to the dietary preferences she had memorized for each of them. She had written the menus, confirmed with cook, managed an 11th-hour change when the sole had not arrived from the fishmonger, and she'd sent quickly for something else. She had dressed in the blue evening gown Roland had not commented on when she'd worn it the previous spring, and she had sat at the foot of the table and managed the conversation at her end with practiced ease, while Roland held court at the head. The evening had gone well. The guests were comfortable. The wine was warm. The sole issue, the non-sole issue, she noted to herself with dry private amusement, had been resolved invisibly. It was during the pudding that Roland, addressing the man to his right, a Mr. Gareth Whitmore, a solicitor from Bristol, who was visiting the county on some county business, said something about the estate management, about how much had been improved in recent years, about the efficiency of the household. Mr. Whitmore had looked down the table at Sylvia, clearly intuiting, as a reasonably perceptive man would, that she might be the relevant party. Roland had not followed his gaze. He had continued speaking. And then, in the particular way that tired men reach, in unguarded moments, for whatever is nearest in memory, he said, Florence always felt these dinners were harder to manage than they needed to be. I wonder what she'd make of how smooth things have become. Mr. Whitmore said carefully, Florence? There was a silence. Sylvia watched Roland process it, the social register, the awareness that something had gone wrong, the quick recalibration. My apologies, Roland said. I misspoke. He did not look at Sylvia. She looked at him. She looked at him very calmly, For long enough to make a decision she had been approaching for 3 months. Perhaps for 3 years. Perhaps, if she were honest, since the night of Colonel Weston's dinner, when she had stood in the doorway and chosen not to speak. She set her spoon down. She folded her napkin. She smiled, because what she felt in that moment was not devastation. It was not even surprise. What she felt was the very specific relief of a woman who has been waiting for permission to believe something she already knew, and has at last received it. She did not make a scene. She did not leave the table. She was far too composed a person, and far too considerate of her guests, to do something theatrical. She stayed through the remainder of the dinner. She said goodbye to the guests at the door with warmth, and said she hoped they would come again. She waited until the last carriage had pulled down the drive. Then she went upstairs. She did not hurry. She packed one case, the medium one, practical, the kind a person packed for a fortnight's travel. And she placed the document she had spent 3 months writing on the desk in Roland's study, weighted with the small stone paperweight he had always kept there. She wrote a brief note and set it on top. She was gone before the household was fully awake. The note said very little, because very little was required. It said that she was well, and that she would be in contact through her solicitor. It said that the document beneath would answer most of the practical questions that arose in her absence. It said that she wished him no ill, and that she hoped he would find the arrangement manageable. She signed it with her name, Sylvia. Not Mrs. Ashishby, not his wife, her name. The cottage in Edinburgh was small and cold in January, and the garden had gone to a state of cheerful disorder that she found, to her considerable surprise, deeply appealing. Her Aunt Harriet, not Mrs. Fenn, not any of the distant aunt figures of formal correspondence, but simply Harriet, who wore her gray hair loose at breakfast, and had opinions about everything and apologized for none of them, met her at the door with tea and asked no questions for the first 3 days. On the 4th day, Sylvia sat down at the small desk by the window that looked onto the disordered garden, and she wrote her first letter to Roland. It was not a letter of grievance. She had thought, in the months of planning, that she might feel the need to explain herself, to justify, to lay out the long catalogue of Colonel Weston dinners and credited estate managers and 7 years of invisible labor. She found, sitting at the desk, that she had no interest in that letter. The accounting was real and she knew it, but delivering it to Roland would serve no purpose she actually wanted served. What she wrote instead was something closer to a straightforward statement. She had left because she had concluded that the life she was living was not a marriage in any meaningful sense, that she had been, for 7 years, an extremely effective employee who happened to reside in the household, and who received, in exchange for her work, security of a kind she no longer required. She did not blame him entirely. She knew, and she said this plainly, that he had not designed the situation with cruelty. She suspected, as she had always suspected, that he had simply not thought about it. This was, she wrote, perhaps the most honest thing she could say. She told him she intended to remain in Edinburgh, and that she would instruct her solicitor to handle any necessary formalities. She told him the document on the desk was complete, and she trusted it would help with the transition. She told him she hoped, genuinely, that he was well. She addressed it to Mr. Ashby, not Roland, not her husband. His name. The response took 11 days. She had not expected it to come. She had told herself this honestly, without bitterness. That Roland was the kind of man who received a letter and set it aside, who found practical problems more tractable than personal ones, who would respond to her departure by engaging the solicitors and returning, with some measure of relief, to the simpler shape of his life. She had been wrong. The letter that came was, she read it twice before she trusted her reading of it, not from the solicitors. It was in Roland's own hand, which she had seen rarely enough in 7 years that it was only half familiar to her. The hand of a man who had gone to good schools and had not written personal correspondence in some time. He began badly. The first paragraph was stiff and procedural, the language of a man who had drafted and redrafted and had not yet found his register. He addressed the practical points first. He had received the document, he had gone over it with the estate manager. It was, he wrote, thorough. He paused there, she suspected for a long time. The second paragraph shifted. She could feel the seam of it, where he had stopped and started again. He wrote that he had not, until she left, understood what she had been doing. He wrote that this was difficult to admit, and he was attempting to be accurate about it, rather than self-serving. He wrote that he had found, in the 3 weeks since her departure, that the number of things requiring his attention, things that had simply been attended to before he registered a need, was considerably larger than he had understood. He did not write this as a complaint. He wrote it, she thought, as a man writing down a thing he needed to admit had been true for a long time. The third paragraph was the most difficult to read. He wrote that when he had said Florence's name, and he wrote the name, did not shy from it, which surprised her. He had not been thinking of Florence. He had been reaching for an easier word, some shorthand for the domestic management of things. And Florence had been the first word his mind had offered, and he had not thought before speaking, because he had been tired, and the wine had been good, and he had not thought before speaking in the way that a man does not think before speaking, when he has never had real cause to. He wrote, I believe I have not had real cause, because you have always managed the consequences of my not thinking. She sat with that sentence for a long time. He wrote that he was not asking her to return. He was writing, he said, because he had been sitting with the document on his desk for 3 weeks, and he had found himself unable to proceed from it to the solicitors in the way he had planned to, and he had eventually understood, after sufficient sitting, that this was because the document was not the thing he needed to respond to. He wrote that he did not know what, if anything, she would want from him. He wrote that he suspected he had not, in 7 years, asked her what she wanted about very much. He wrote that he was aware of the circularity of asking now. He asked anyway. She did not answer immediately. She put the letter in the desk drawer and went out into the garden, which was still in the pleasant disorder she had not yet brought herself to tidy. The January air was sharp and clean. The cottage backed onto a small hill, and from the top of the hill, on clear days, you could see a gray edge of water in the distance. She stood at the top of the hill for a while. She was not thinking, particularly. She was doing the thing she had not had enough time to do in 7 years. She was simply standing somewhere, in a place that was hers, in weather that had nothing to do with anyone's dinner party. After a long while, she walked back down. She thought about Roland's letter. She thought about what it was and what it wasn't. It was not a performance of contrition. She had known him long enough, in her sideways kind of knowing, to recognize that. He was not a man who could perform contrition convincingly, because he was not a man with much practice at it. What the letter had the quality of, she thought, was something rarer in her experience of him. Genuine encounter with his own opacity. A man arriving at something he did not like the look of, and writing it down anyway. She thought about what she wanted. Not what was practical, not what was appropriate, not what the solicitors would find sensible, what she actually wanted. She found, a great many things. She wanted to continue living in Edinburgh, at least for the time being. She wanted to continue the work she had begun, quietly and with Harriet's amused support, on a proposal she had been developing. A small charitable project, connected to one of the women's organizations in the city, that needed someone with organizational capacity and no other place to be. She wanted to read, in the evenings, at the desk by the window, without any portion of her attention allocated to a household that required her. She wanted, she also found, to write to him again. Not to reconcile, not yet, perhaps not ever, but to say something she had not said in 7 years. Several things. She thought of the night she had stood in the study doorway after Colonel Weston's dinner. She thought of all the sentences she had dissolved. She went inside and sat at the desk. She wrote him a real letter this time, a longer one. The one that had been accumulating, it seemed to her as she wrote it, since approximately the 4th year of their marriage. She wrote about Colonel Weston. She wrote about Florence's portrait, and what she had come to think about the expression in it. She wrote about the estate management document and the 3 months it had taken, and what she had been thinking while she produced it. Not resentment, she wanted him to understand, but a kind of deliberate care for something that deserved to be properly handed off. She wrote about the morning she had made the decision, which was not the night of the January dinner, but a morning in November when she had stood in the corridor and finally, for the first time, looked at Florence properly. She wrote, I am not asking you to have been different. I am asking you, if you wish to continue corresponding, to be different now, not for my sake, particularly, but because I think you are capable of it, and I think you have simply never been in a position where the absence of it cost you anything. She wrote, I am not certain what I want from you either, but I think I would like to find out. She signed it Sylvia, and posted it before she could think too carefully about it. Spring came slowly in Edinburgh, but it came. The garden at the cottage had been properly looked at by then, and Sylvia had found that her instinct for management extended, with some modification, to things that grew, that the same combination of patience and attention she had brought to tenant correspondence served adequately, though differently, in the matter of what she was choosing to encourage and what she was choosing to let go. She had received 4 more letters from Roland. They improved, each one. The stiffness broke down incrementally, the way ice breaks on a river, not all at once, but in sections, until one day she noticed the water was moving freely where it had been solid before. He had engaged a competent estate manager, a woman, which surprised her, and which he mentioned with something that she read, between the lines, as a deliberate acknowledgement. He had begun, he wrote, to attend to the tenant correspondence personally, because the document she had left had shown him things he had not understood were being done. He did not ask, in any of these letters, when she was returning. She noticed this and was grateful for it. He wrote instead about Thornfield. Not the management of it, but the character of it. The things he observed now that he was paying a different kind of attention. He wrote about the old oak at the edge of the east field, which he had apparently looked at properly for the first time and found remarkable. He wrote about a conversation with one of the older tenants that had been, he said, unexpectedly illuminating. He wrote about Florence, once, briefly, carefully, saying only that he thought he had handled his grief in a way that had made him less present to the things around him than he should have been, and that he was aware this did not excuse anything, but he had wanted to say it. She wrote back. Every letter. She told him about the charitable project which had grown beyond the initial proposal into something with actual funding and 2 people working in it and a set of rooms in the city. She told him about Harriet, who had turned out to be one of the more interesting people she had ever spent sustained time with, and who had strong views about the management of property and the independence of women that Sylvia found she agreed with entirely. She told him about the garden. She did not tell him she was coming back. She did not tell him she was not. What she told him in the last letter she wrote before the question could no longer be deferred was this: that she had been happy in Edinburgh, that this had surprised her. Not the fact of it, but the texture of it, the way a life that was entirely her own felt different from a life that had always been primarily in service of someone else's. She told him she did not think she could return to the old arrangement. She also told him she had thought, more than she might have expected, about the man who had written those 4 letters. Not the man who had failed to follow Mr. Whitmore's gaze. The other one. She told him that she did not know what shape anything might take, that she thought shape required time and honesty and a degree of shared discomfort that was not something she was willing to take on trust. That if he was willing to have an actual conversation, not correspondence, not managed from a distance, but a real one, in person, in which she would say things he might not find comfortable, she was willing to have it. She told him she would be in Bath the following month, visiting her father, that if he wanted to meet, she would arrange it, that if he did not, she would understand, and the solicitors could proceed. She posted it on a Tuesday morning, walked back through the Edinburgh streets to the office where her project had its rooms, and sat down to work. He came to Bath. He arrived at her father's house on a Thursday afternoon with his hat in his hand. Literally, she observed with a private note of amusement, as if he had forgotten what to do with it. And when she opened the parlor door, and they looked at each other for the first time in 4 months, there was a long moment in which neither of them spoke. He looked, she thought, somewhat changed, not dramatically. Roland was not a man of dramatic transformations, but he looked like someone who had been spending time paying attention to things he had previously passed without registering, and it had altered, slightly, something in his bearing. She offered him tea. She did not rush. They talked for 3 hours. She said the things she had written in letters, and the things she had not. He listened, and this, she found, was the thing she had not entirely predicted. He listened in a way she did not remember him listening in 7 years of marriage. Not with the listening of a man waiting to speak, but with the listening of a man trying to understand something. He did not defend himself. He did not minimize. He said, at one point, that he had gone back through the accounting of the last 7 years, the estate accounts, the household records, and he had understood, in a way he had not understood from inside it, the scale of what she had been doing. He said it with the particular expression of a man confronting something he cannot revise. She did not say, "Yes, I know." She said, "Thank you for looking." They did not reach any tidy conclusion that afternoon. There was no scene of tearful recognition, no clear agreement about what came next. When he left, they had established only that they would continue talking, that she would remain in Edinburgh through the summer, that he would come north, if she was willing, in September. She walked to the end of her father's front path and watched the carriage until it turned the corner, and then she stood in the early evening air, and she took stock of herself. She was not certain she would go back. She thought she might. She was certain of almost nothing except this, that whatever happened next, she would be the one who decided it. Not because she was stubborn, Not because she wanted to punish anyone, but because she had spent 7 years inside a life that had been built around someone else's decisions, and someone else's comfort, and someone else's failures of imagination. And she was finished with that arrangement. She was 29 years old. The project had funding. The garden in Edinburgh was beginning, uncertainly and with considerable encouragement, to become something. She walked back inside. Whatever she decided, she would decide it from here, from this particular standing, in a life that was, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, entirely her own to arrange.